What do you know about the past, and how do you know it? Our species stretches back over 300,000 years, yet we only have written records for the last 2% of that time. Across the long preceding ages, how many cultures, kingdoms, and even empires have vanished? All evidence of their existence now turned to dust. Today, archaeologists can carbon date artifacts and sequence DNA with computers, yet the picture of the deep past that emerges is often frustratingly incomplete. For the majority of our time on this planet, humanity has relied on myth to tell us the story of who we are and where we came from. Today, we often think of myths as fantasies, fairy tales for simple-minded primitives. We read about science myth-busting old ideas, demonstrating how superior our knowledge is to that of our ancestors. But perhaps we shouldn't be so quick to draw these conclusions. We've begun to discover that some myths are rooted in truth. Troy, the famous city attacked by Greek heroes in the Iliad, had been thought fiction for hundreds of years, an invention of Homeric epic poetry. That is, until Heinrich Schliemann's team discovered its remains and those of its arch-rival Mycenae in the late 19th century, completely shifting the paradigm around the credibility of ancient sources. The Great Flood myths of many cultures have often been considered religious parable. Yet recent studies suggest they may reflect cultural memories of rapidly rising sea levels, like those that caused massive, catastrophic flooding of the Black Sea around 7300 BC. Such evidence opens a tantalizing door, inviting us to wonder about ancient civilizations, of which no true records exist. But there's one myth that's unlike others for a simple reason. It has dates attached to it. That myth is Atlantis. Most of us only have a foggy notion of what the Atlantis myth was really about. Was it an advanced civilization from a missing period in prehistory? Or a decadent society on a lost continent, crushed by the wrath of the gods in a cataclysmic event? And if so, how exactly does a continent get lost in the first place? Let's begin with what Atlantis is, a story written down around 2,400 years ago here in Athens. The story is a strange one. Solon, famous lawgiver of the Athenian state and one of the 7 sages of ancient Greece, journeyed to the Temple of Sais in the Egyptian Nile Delta around 600 BC. He spoke with the high priests there about the prehistoric past and told them the Greeks' own mythical version of these events, stretching back to the Great Flood of Deucalion, and estimated what the true dates might have been. An elder priest responded, "O Solon, Solon, you Greeks are always children. No Greek is old. You're young, let us say, in psyche, because you do not have inside you any hearing of ancient knowledge, and you have not learned of things of the past." The priest describes a past interspersed with natural disasters, droughts, wildfires, and not one, but many floods. It's a long past the Greeks have forgotten through a lack of continuity. Their culture had to reinvent itself after each disaster, its populace reduced to a life of basic subsistence. The Egyptians, by contrast, had escaped most of these disasters and maintained ongoing records of events in their temples, including a major story the priest is quite certain the Greeks have forgotten. Atlantis. It was said to be a continent with a mighty empire that existed around 9600 BC, ruled by 10 kings descended from Poseidon, god of the sea. Its capital city was astoundingly large and decadent. Its army and navy enormous. Its wealth was unmatched. as was its thirst for conquest. It swept across North Africa, eventually conquering Egypt, and assaulted the western Mediterranean coast of Europe, up to central Italy. After a series of wars, it was finally defeated by the ancestors of the Athenians, who liberated Egypt and many other peoples, only to lose their army in the final assault on the capital of this belligerent power during a horrific earthquake and series of floods. The idea that an unknown continent sank into the ocean and the mystery surrounding its location has generated debate for hundreds, if not thousands of years. Most doubt it ever existed. But perhaps the most bizarre thing about the myth of Atlantis is its source, Plato, the greatest philosopher of the classical Greek world. Plato was born into the noble classes of Periclean Athens, toward the end of its golden age of culture and worldly success. He grew up during the worst civil war in Greek history between Athens and Sparta, and as a young man was educated by distinguished teachers. Following the defeat of Athens and the death of his mentor Socrates in 399 BC, Plato packed up and disappeared. For the next 12 years, we're told that he traveled the Mediterranean, studying with the greatest minds of the age in places like Sicily, southern Italy, and Egypt. Around age 40, he returned to Athens, where he founded a school called the Academy and taught great thinkers like Aristotle, as well as authoring dozens of books on philosophy. The fact he wrote about such a strange story in not just one, but two of his books is something of a puzzle in itself. He wasn't an entertainer for kids' birthday parties. He was a masterful thinker who crafted some of the most complex works at the very foundation of Western thought. Vague notions of a lost civilization that sank beneath the waves have sparked innumerable interpretations from Jules Verne to Disney in the roughly 2,400 years since Plato's death. Whatever the Atlantis myth once represented has been washed from our minds by a tsunami of pop culture.
Atlantis, a land that harnessed the power of a volcano's fiery heart and learned to store the energy of the sun in giant crystals, then used them to create secret weapons whose disintegrating rays could destroy the rest of the world.
All this bogus Atlantis imagery has also had a side effect, spawning an almost obsessive interest by fringe theorists in uncovering a lost continent sunken beneath the ocean. Ignatius L. Donnelly's Atlantis, the Antediluvian World of 1882 was among the first to propose a massive continent that sank into the depths of the Atlantic Ocean, the survivors of which allegedly fled to start new civilizations everywhere from the Yucatan to Egypt. Donnelly surmised the Azores Islands were the tips of this huge landmass, a theory that, despite being incorrect, has somehow persisted to the present day in some circles. The fact that Plato borrowed certain allegories and metaphors from older traditions has led a number of scholars to propose the myth of Atlantis was inspired by a series of actual events, such as the powerful and deadly eruption of Thera on Santorini, the Sea Peoples invasions, or even the Trojan War. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. The location of Atlantis has been proclaimed across the globe. With such a flood of wild goose chase theories, it's not surprising that most classicists today consider the Atlantis myth as simply an allegory invented by Plato to explain the dangers of hubris, bad government, and military aggression. But not everyone agrees.
Plato was the greatest philosopher of all times. My major question was why a so rational man was occupied writing myths. This is the beginning of the story 20 years ago.
George Sarantitis does not believe in sinking continents. An independent researcher of the ancient Greek world, he's authored papers on a broad range of topics, combining his knowledge of the ancient language with geography, sailing, and climate change to reconstruct pictures of the past that have confused scholars for centuries. His work on dating the Iliad through reference to astronomy has even been recognized by the Greek Academy. Nearly 20 years ago, George turned his attention to the work of his favorite philosopher, Plato.
The main characteristic of Plato is to put you in the problem. Demands very logic sequence. You cannot escape by doing things that do not fit. Otherwise, you don't have results.
Unlike many other philosophers who sought to build perfect systems, few, if any, of Plato's writings can be said to advocate a cut-and-dried set of positions. His dialogues often seem to have dissatisfaction and puzzlement, even with the doctrines he seems to be presenting for our consideration. In this sense, his exact positions often seem something of a mystery.
Plato was writing these myths for other high educated persons. What is the benefit of an educated person or a student of Plato? What he could take from a myth? That was the puzzle that I would like to solve.
George began analyzing Plato's philosophical dialogues, looking for patterns in the way he wrote about myths, and over time formulated a series of axioms. The theory he developed, he titled Methodology of Mythology, a theory he formally presented in a series of papers at conferences throughout the first decade of the 21st century. The theory suggests Plato deliberately constructed his myths for use as a teaching tool, and that consistent grammatical clues within them turn the stories into a kind of mental gymnasium for advanced students.
Gradually, you see that there is a systematic writing of a myth. There is a frequent appearance of axioms, or the axiom that you have found from the beginning, you might see it later on, and you can predict that you're going to find in front of you such a thing, because there are also some warnings within the text. He might use two similarly sounding words in the beginning, at the end of the paragraph, but with much different meaning. Do not underestimate any detail to find out the tricks, the laws or axioms or systems the mythographer is following up to construct a myth. It's a very high scientific document, and you can use it to teach either a child or an initiate.
The story of Atlantis is briefly summarized in a book called Timaeus. The rest of this long dialogue then goes on to focus on seemingly unrelated subjects. Plato's later dialogue, Critias, on the other hand, is a description of the ancient conflict between the Athens of 9600 BC and the hostile Atlantean Empire, and it seems to have been cut off mid-sentence. Most believe that either the book was unfinished or that the rest has simply been lost to history. George collected several of the best modern Greek and English translations of Critias and Timaeus and began to dig into them. Soon, he noticed an unusual pattern. All the translations were in agreement for the most part, but certain areas of complex description were often rendered completely differently, with various degrees of incompatible, even conflicting logic.
When you see so many different meanings coming out of from different translations, something is wrong. Πολλά μένουν ημών και μεγάλα έργα της πόλεως, τι δε γεγραμμένα, θαυμάζεται.
He went back to the source documents, the ancient Greek texts themselves, and began to compare the modern translations to Plato's original words.
One of the very first things is that I had read Atlantic Ocean. There is no Atlantic Ocean on the ancient text.
We can see the same thing in many common English translations. For these histories tell of a mighty power which, unprovoked, made an expedition against the whole of Europe and Asia, and to which your city put an end. This power came forth out of the Atlantic Ocean, for in those days the Atlantic was navigable.
It says Atlantic Pelagos. Pelagos and ocean have no connection at all. They have much different properties.
To get to Atlantis from Greece, you had to cross a large body of water, previously translated as Atlantic Ocean. But the actual ancient Greek says Atlantic Pelagos, something more like the Aegean Sea, partially enclosed by land. This meant something important. Atlantis couldn't possibly be where earlier researchers, like Ignatius Donnelly, had said it was. But if Plato wasn't referring to the Atlantic Ocean, what was this mysterious Atlantic Pelagos that led to Atlantis? And were there other aspects of the ancient Greek that were being lost in translation?
It's like mathematics. If you are giving wrong data, you have a wrong result. A lot of different translators were not able to translate correctly the ancient text. And this was the spark and the main cause to push me to start retranslate the whole two books, Timaeus and Critias, from the beginning.
George proceeded to spend over 2 years and 4,000 hours working with Athens University philologist Eva Dakia to formulate new translations of these two books to ensure he was correctly verifying every rule of syntax and grammar.
The same word on the 6th century might have different meaning, on the 5th century different, on the 4th century different. You need the correct meaning of every word, phrase, line, and paragraph. Otherwise, you're reading a wrong story.
Once he had the words, then he rebuilt the phrases, then the sentences, because a changed sentence will change the meaning of a paragraph, which can alter the meaning of an entire book. George began to see that Plato's geography was far more specific than he or anyone else had realized before. Bit by bit, the pieces of the map began to take form, based on the meaning of key words. Besides okeanos, Greek has 3 main words for large bodies of water we would call seas. The Mediterranean Sea is a thalassa. The Aegean is a pelagos, a sea that encloses islands like an embrace. Pontos, what we call in English the Black Sea, Greeks called the Euxenos Pontos.
And Pontos is not a pelagos, and it's not an ocean. But in all the translations, all these are named ocean or sea.
Through close analysis of the grammar in Critias and Timaeus, George was also able to identify and define 3 key terms that had previously been translated interchangeably as island to great confusion: a continent, an island, and the sacred center island of the Atlantean capital city, the size and concentric ringed shape of which are explained in great, albeit confusing, detail. Tradition has it that the phrase, "Let no one ignorant of geometry enter here," was carved above the door to Plato's Academy. If he included complex geometrical diagrams, very specific geographic terms, and directional orientations, we have to ask, why are they there?
If it was about a fairy tale, you don't need to give such details. It was instructions how to approach Atlantis. Start entering the Pillars of Heracles, which is characterized as a mouth, where the larger cavity is the Mediterranean and the smaller cavity is an Atlantic Pelagos. After you pass these pillars of Heracles. You are in front of an Atlantic pelagos, and then you have in front of you an island, a very large one, and characterize it as well as a continent. For this continent, he describes a semi-curved shape of land, larger than Asia and Libya in length, where either by going through the continent or through islands step by step, somewhere in the middle of this curve, you can find something like a harbor, then a poros, a narrow passage, to pass in another pelagos after you have left behind you a pondos, different sea. Then you are in front of an island which is located in the middle of this landmass of the island continent. And then suddenly, I had a new reality in my mind.
According to Plato, to get to Atlantis by sea, one first had to pass the Pillars of Heracles. So, not surprisingly, George's first question was, where are the Pillars of Heracles? The answer, ever since Rome conquered the entire Mediterranean, has been that the pillars are located near the Strait of Gibraltar, perhaps with one in Europe and one in Africa. But this was not always the case. When George began to dig, he found there had been considerable confusion and dispute among ancient authors over precisely what and where the Pillars of Heracles were.
As an average person, I knew that Pillars of Heracles is somewhere in Gibraltar. But Plato is giving you instructions, and it's giving a different direction where to find the Pillars of Heracles. You have to study very hard the text to understand where this place is.
While examining the differences in descriptions between the two books, George realized Greek grammar was the key to narrowing in on the location of the pillars and the mysterious Atlantic pelagos. There's a subtle difference in how language is used in Timaeus versus Critias. The closest parallel in English might be the way we use this versus that, or here and there. This here means something proximate. That there means something distant. The Egyptian priest speaks of this here Libya, referring to a place that's adjacent to his location and the Nile Delta at Sais. This grammatical nuance can be used to pin down relative locations in the story based on who was speaking and where that person was at that moment in time. The writings refer to how mighty was the force that marched in arrogance at the same time against all of Europe and Asia, that campaigned out of the Atlantic pelagos. The fact that the Atlanteans campaigned out of the Atlantic pelagos suggests it is inside the Pillars of Heracles, that they demarcate a kind of regional border, and that Europe and Asia are on the outside of the pillars.
If the grammar and syntax was correct, the two Pillars of Heracles both should exist within Africa.
But where? Known as the father of history, the ancient Greek author Herodotus wrote his famous work a generation before Plato. It was widely known throughout the Greek world for the travels he'd undertaken all around the Mediterranean, reporting on the kingdoms and people he discovered. In Book 4 of his history, he describes the voyage of a Samian ship that was blown off course and made landfall on the Libyan coast at modern Bamba. They then set sail for Egypt, but a powerful easterly wind drove them in the opposite direction, all the way through the Pillars of Heracles to a place called Tartessus. The location of Tartessus has been recently ascribed to southern Spain. However, the Dictionary of Greek and Roman Geography notes that its location was uncertain among the ancients. George soon saw the problem in another light. A longtime sailor, he did some quick math and realized that at the rates of sea travel in Herodotus' era, the Samian ship's journey to Gibraltar would have taken somewhere between 20 and 30 days and involved sailing hundreds of kilometers northward, completely around Tunisia, all the time without making landfall.
It's impossible to have made this journey in the given time. Gibraltar could not be the place where the pillars of Heracles were.
There was another, much more logical location for the ancient pillars of Heracles, the Gulf of Gabes in modern Tunisia. A journey to the Gulf of Gabes would have taken only 6 to 10 days instead of the 20 or 30 to Gibraltar. But if the Gulf of Gabes was where the pillars of Heracles were in Plato's era, where was the Atlantic Pelagos that they supposedly led to?
If every word he's using has been translated in your mind correctly, you will find the right way.
While today, the linkage to inland Africa is blocked up, the Gulf once connected the Mediterranean Sea to a large series of salt lakes called shots. Today, these shots are only navigable by the smallest of boats, and even then, only during Tunisia's annual wet season. This positioning for the Pillars of Heracles and the Atlantic Pelagos starts to make sense if we look back at Plato's statement that, at that time, their Pelagos was navigable. Plato seems to be saying that at the time of Atlantis, the shots were once a larger sea leading to inland Africa and deep enough to be sailed by ships, but that in his own time, the Pelagos had silted up. By contrast, the Roman-era location of the Pillars of Heracles at the Strait of Gibraltar was never impassable to ships. That waterway hasn't closed up since the Mediterranean Sea refilled around 4.8 million years ago.
Gibraltar could not be the place where the pillars of Heracles were. If you are able to catch this detail, then you get the picture.
The new picture meant something startling and important. The map of the world looked different in the age of Atlantis.
Atlantis should be the west part of Africa, and only there.
The lost continent of myth had been hiding in plain sight all along. How hard was it really to believe that a place that contained the Atlas Mountains, bordered the Atlantic Ocean, and contained a kingdom that Herodotus had once called the Atalantes had been called Atlantis in prehistoric times? But there's a much bigger problem. Most of Western Africa today is covered by lifeless Sahara Desert. So even if the geography seemed to fit, how could any of the story be true in the first place?
The text contains the truth.
Today, the Sahara is an inhospitable expanse. But starting at the dawn of the Holocene, and down until as recently as 3000 BC, it was a lush, green landscape supporting an enormous array of animals and fish hunted by our ancestors. Today, we call this period the Green Sahara. What did this world actually look like? And was it anything like the world of Plato's myth? Cyclic changes altered the pattern of the African monsoon rains, causing them to intensify and move northward around 11,000 BC. These powerful monsoons not only replaced desert with vegetation and large animals, they also transformed the few tiny lakes across North Africa from Clark Kent into Superman. More than 12,000 lakes have been identified, likely covering over 1 million square kilometers at their maximum extent. hyper-arid desert was replaced by savanna and swiftly inhabited by prehistoric people who roamed there for thousands of years. Archaeologists have corroborated the tales told by ancient rock art with finds of bone fishhooks and harpoons in the middle of the desert. 5 massive river systems flowed out from the central mountain ranges of Africa, linking vast mosaics of tributaries and wetlands. This allowed aquatic species to travel, including not just fish, but crocodiles and hippopotami. In 2020, a research team confirmed crocodiles are still living in a rocky plateau in southern Mauritania, a place now utterly surrounded by desert. The waterways of the Green Sahara once extended here, all the way from the Nile River. For a moment, if we close our eyes, we can imagine a map of 2 continents at the dawn of the Holocene. A North Africa divided by seas, lakes, and rivers into Libya and Atlantis. Was this the real world Plato's myth was communicating a distant memory of in Timaeus and Critias?
It would certainly answer a lot of questions.
Climate facts make George's theory plausible. But what about the rest of the myth? Let's see if we can reassemble the pieces of the Atlantis puzzle. George's work meant the Atlantis story could no longer be dismissed as complete fantasy. If the myth isn't all made up, then we have our work cut out for us to determine which elements might be false and which true. Our tale begins around 9600 BC, at the dawn of the Green Sahara period. It's also roughly the same point at which modern scientists mark the beginning of the Holocene epoch, a geologic time period that continues down to the present day. We're told the Atlanteans of this era initiated a great war, spreading eastward across Africa and conquering everything in their path. Who were these mysterious Atlanteans?
Herodotus writes an enigmatic phrase in his history when he speaks of both Eastern and Western Ethiopians, who dwelled at the extreme ends of the African continent. Homer, too, in the Odyssey, writes of the Ethiopians who dwell split in 2, some who dwell where the sun rises and some where he sets.
The root of the ancient Greek Ethiopia comes from Etho, burn, and Ops, face, the land of those with darkened faces. The ancient Greeks seemed to believe that there were 2 major groups of dark-skinned North African people, somehow divided by an east-west split. Were the dark-skinned inhabitants of Mauritania from Herodotus's era the direct descendants of the mythic Atlanteans? And were these the kind of people Plato had in mind when he wrote his books?
There just might be a hidden reality behind these descriptions from ancient Greek writers.
Current linguistic research suggests the people who spoke the 2 major North African language groups did in fact split sometime in the deep past. They were likely isolated from one another during a long dry period, and then reconnected during the Green Sahara. They differed not only in language, but in their ways of life, and so much so that researchers have called them the land people and the water people. The water people spoke the language group known as Nilo-Saharan. The expansion of waterways when the Green Sahara began led to rapid north and westward outmigration of these people. They hunted fish, crocodiles, and hippos using barbed harpoons and bone fishhooks. The land people, by contrast, were savanna hunters who used bows and arrows. They spoke the language family called Niger-Congo, which seems to have originated in the region of modern-day Mauritania. They migrated south and eastward across the Sahara during the wet period. Evidence of their presence spans northern Africa. climate, and human migration might actually support the idea of an Atlantean people. But were epic battles like those in the myth really a feature of the early Holocene? It's tempting to see the myth of an aggressive Atlantean empire that took over North Africa as based on the expansion of Niger-Congo-speaking hunters in the early Holocene. The time period was similar, and so was the general direction of movement. Perhaps the cultural memories of the Nile Valley people who encountered these intruders have found their way down to us in a mythical reconstruction of events. This is, however, complete speculation. While the true origins of the mythical Atlantean War may be in doubt, what is not in doubt is that wars were indeed taking place in ancient North Africa. Jebel Sahaba, northern Sudan. A prehistoric massacre took place here between two different cultural groups around 11,000 BC. In the 1960s, archaeologists first uncovered a large number of skeletons with stone arrowheads embedded in them. These attacks may have taken place over months or even years in a kind of ongoing war. The closer we get to the early Holocene, the more evidence accumulates for armed conflict by large groups. Cave paintings show teams of archers confronting one another, attacking or fleeing. Did a real Atlantean army march east across North Africa 11,600 years ago, annihilating resistance with barrages of stone-tipped arrows and seizing territory all the way to the Nile? Or might the wars of the myth be a projection from Plato's own time? Plato was no stranger to violence. His childhood was spent in the shadow of the worst civil war in Greek history. Athens and its allies were engaged in bloody combat with Sparta and its allies from 431 BC up until he was 6 or 7 years old. A brief peace ensued, but by the time Plato reached adolescence in 415 BC, war had broken out again. It lasted another 11 years, during which time Plato himself saw military service, before Athens finally succumbed to a Spartan blockade and had to surrender. Some see a parallel between the historical Athens and the one in the Atlantis myth. The Peloponnesian War of Plato's childhood was triggered by a Spartan ally's attack, and the Athenians saw themselves as being on the defensive. In the Atlantis myth, the Atlanteans begin as the aggressors and are righteously repulsed by the Athens of 9600 BC. The second phase of the Peloponnesian War saw Athens as the aggressor when they attacked Syracuse in Sicily by sea. In the myth, Athens also became the aggressor when they marched all the way to the gates of the Atlantean capital city. The complete destruction of the Athenian military in the myth might mirror the total loss of the Athenian army in the assault on Syracuse during the second phase of the Peloponnesian War. Was the Atlantean War real? Total fabrication? Or a blend of myth, history, and cultural memory?
He's giving this with a Platonic way. You have to decipher, you have to extract from the text.
Plato is our only source for Atlantis. Solely by proving or refuting his story can we get to the truth. Unfortunately, archaeological evidence is scarce, and the region as a whole is, in general, poorly studied. If we want to know whether story elements, like the vast Atlantean trade networks, were real, we have to look at analogous evidence from other areas of North Africa and the Mediterranean.
International trade's something we consider a hallmark of modern globalization. The idea that an Atlantean society was trading across continents more than 11,000 years ago seems impossible.
But it's not. 8,000-year-old DNA from an underwater site off the shore of the UK has generated a strange revelation. Hunter-gatherers were consuming two types of domesticated wheat here long before anyone in Britain began cultivating grain. These wheat species have no wild ancestors in Northern Europe. They weren't grown locally. They arrived from the Middle East through a trade network spanning the entire European continent. Continent-sweeping trade networks existed in the Stone Age. But what about ancient seafaring? If an Atlantean army really attacked Europe, they had to do more than cross lakes and rivers. They had to cross the open sea itself. Experts often tell us that Egypt was the world's first great maritime society. And it's been proclaimed that massive 60-ton Egyptian vessels from 1800 BC were the world's oldest seagoing boats. But according to Plato's story, both Greek and African seafaring began at least 8,000 years earlier. Recent discoveries are beginning to move the needle in Plato's favor. Scientists have discovered obsidian tools in central Tunisia that originated in the 6th millennium BC. But they come from an island called Pantelleria, roughly 60 kilometers from the Tunisian coast. To acquire the obsidian for these tools means a round trip of over 120 kilometers across open sea, thousands of years before historians believed this was possible. More hard evidence in Greece from the era of the Atlantis myth suggests that at least part of Plato's story is solidly rooted in fact.
Just outside Athens is a site called Shistu Cave, where people brought offerings from prehistory all the way down to Roman times. Obsidian tools uncovered there demonstrate that the region has been inhabited for at least 14,000 years, corroborating Plato's assertions in the myth. The shocking thing about this is not the tools themselves or even the early date, but rather where they came from. The island of Milos in the center of the Aegean Sea.
Obsidian tools and weapons from Milos have been recently discovered all around the Aegean. Their presence tells us that extensive seafaring trade was taking place in Greece from at least 13,000 BC. It also means prehistoric Greeks were sailing long distances more than 3,000 years before the events of the Atlantis myth.
So if people were conducting trade this way 15 millennia ago, why haven't we found any of their boats?
In fact, we've begun to. In 1987, a Nigerian man digging a well struck a bizarre object near the village of Dafuna. When excavated, the strange item revealed itself to be a 27-foot-long canoe. Dated to around 6500 BC, it would have been in use right in the middle of the Green Sahara period, less than 50 kilometers from the shores of Lake Megachad. The water people who used it were linked to the lake by huge networks of rivers and wetlands that filled the region. Because of its skillful construction, experts believe the canoe represents a tradition that had already undergone long development in the distant past. 5 meters below the surface, layers of clay protected the Dafuna canoe from decay in an oxygen-free environment. Without that clay, it would have deteriorated completely, and ancient African boat travel might have remained speculation. The reason more ancient boats aren't sitting in museums today isn't because they didn't exist. It's simply because they were made of organic materials.
Clearly, the claim that the Egyptians had the earliest seafaring boats in 1800 BC is simply untrue. Just how untrue is almost mind-blowing.
Crete is the largest island in Greece, hundreds of kilometers from the North African coast. It detached from the mainland around 5 million years ago and has remained a separate island ever since. We used to think it was first colonized around 6500 BC and was entirely unpopulated before that time. However, that thinking has changed. Artifacts were recently discovered indicating that the first humans must have arrived on Crete by sea at least 130,000 years ago.
The deeper we look, the more evidence seems to appear in support of Plato's assertion that seafaring isn't a new story, it's a very old story.
If Greek or Atlantean armies wanted to cross the Mediterranean Sea by ship in 9600 BC, it was possible.
As astonishing as the facts we've unearthed are, there are some major missing pieces to the Atlantis puzzle. Not all of Plato's descriptions seem to represent a realistic portrayal of ancient West Africa in 9600 BC.
Let's revisit some of the myth's claims. We're told of a ringed capital city, nearly 40 kilometers across, set into a huge pointed island in the center of the Atlantean continent. It was filled with glorious buildings and temples, as well as harbors bustling with trade from all over. The city's massive stone walls, over 30 meters wide and dozens of kilometers long, were supposedly covered in copper, tin, and a sparkling metal called orichalcum. The inhabitants of the capital region were farmers who harvested crops twice a year with the aid of an enormous irrigation system comprising thousands of kilometers of canals. This kingdom, one of 10 that made up the empire, was said to field an army of over 1 million men by itself, with a navy of 1,200 ships, greater than any known fleet of the ancient world. Could all these things have been true in 9600 BC? Metallurgy. The Atlantis myth claims the empire made widespread use of metal. The current narrative of ancient African metallurgy doesn't support Plato's descriptions of copper, silver, bronze, or gold being used in large amounts by early Holocene people in West Africa. Humanity's use of copper did begin as early as 10,000 BC in other locations, but we usually find it only in small tools, spear tips, or jewelry beads. Plato's descriptions of kilometers-long walls clad with sheets of tin and copper simply can't be real. Agriculture. While semi-domesticated grains from the early Holocene have been found in Egypt at sites like Nabta Playa, so far, there's no evidence of farming in Western Africa until around 3000 BC, and then only at one isolated site in Morocco. Irrigation. Appearing along the Nile for over 5,000 years, and later used at large scale in Libya by the Garamantes, irrigation has been found in few other places across North Africa to date. Population.
To support the 1.6 million man army of just one of the 10 Atlantean kingdoms would have required a population 6 times that size, bordering on 10 million. Ancient population numbers are being revised upward today, and the best estimates we have are between 1 and 10 million people, but that's across the entire planet.
Cities.
Athens, Sais, and the ring capital city of Atlantis were all supposed to have existed more than 10,000 years ago, according to the myth. While early cities did exist in the Middle East during that time frame, so far, nothing matching Plato's descriptions has been unearthed.
There's another important concern as well. Not everyone agrees about the nature and extent of the waterways that existed in the Green Sahara period. It's possible the map of Atlantis didn't look exactly the way it's been theorized. Does this mean that the vision of an ancient, African, Atlantean city is nothing more than just a fantasy?
Mysterious stone structures have been found across the Sahara.
What do these structures mean? What was their purpose? Are they burial sites? Were they places of ritual and sacrifice? Or the remnants of defensive fortifications? Were they outposts of a dying Atlantean empire whose constructs faded into dust long ago? While they are intriguing, most of these structures are thought to date from a few thousand years BC. And in no way do they resemble the grand Atlantean city of the myth.
There's good reason not to believe Plato's myth was true, even if Atlantis was an ancient name for West Africa, and Green Sahara waterways partitioned it in some way from the rest of the continent. Other aspects of the tale are ambiguous, but there's one major piece of evidence that's difficult for skeptics to dismiss.
If George was right about the location of Atlantis, then exactly in the center of the curved continent, there should be the remains of a ringed capital city, roughly 40 kilometers across. The Reshat structure is a prominent circular feature in the Adrar Plateau in Mauritania. It developed due to tectonic activity going back hundreds of millions of years. Today, it appears as concentric rings, a circular structure unique on our planet. Because of its roughly 40-kilometer size and relative flatness, it cannot be seen from land in its entirety. Freshwater fossils confirm the general area was once home to significant amounts of water. In the early Holocene, the Reshat might have been a fisherman's paradise. Scientists who examined the site in the 1970s discovered huge amounts of stone tools in the sediments of the ringed valleys. Was this the lost capital city of Atlantis? George took one more step most people might not.
So I took the plane, went there with my instruments, and measured all these new formations that were referred on the Platonic text.
A professional engineer, George traveled to the Reshat in 2008 with a small team of locals and took GPS measurements, along with readings from altimeters. His results matched exceptionally well with the shape he had derived analytically from Plato's texts.
Could you think that I could be calm after that discovery?
George's new translation finally illuminated certain vague nuances that were proven out on location. There is not one outer ring, but two. One of the rings is a twin ring. Another small ring encloses the central sacred isle. Furthermore, there is a canal parallel to an original natural waterway. It connects to the sea with a flow that is synetetrito, involving harbors facing one another. There is also an oddly placed 9.5-kilometer canal along the next inner ring, and thus, the picture we get of the city looks like this.
If the resemblance of the Rashat structure to Plato's geography is just a coincidence, it is a remarkable coincidence.
But there was no prize awarded to George Sarantitis or ticker tape parade. Instead, one person after another cashed in on his years of research without really understanding it. Many of them made outlandish suggestions, stating that ocean levels were hundreds of meters higher in the Holocene, claiming that continent-sweeping floods purged North Africa. Or worse, it seems unlikely that any of these fringe theorists speak ancient Greek.
You have to prove, according to the Platonic text, where Atlantis is.
In Plato's writings, a philosopher is one who seeks the truth and develops a true understanding of the subject at hand. A sophist, by contrast, might hold a true opinion, but they lack any real knowledge of what underpins it. It ought to be clear by now to which category George belongs versus his imitators.
Believe me, it was a very difficult task.
At last, we come to a final question. Atlantis was supposed to have sunk into the sea, disappearing in a single day and night. I'm here at Mount Lycabettus in Athens, 277 meters above sea level. Even if every single ice sheet on the entire planet melted, the rising oceans would not even come close to where I'm sitting right now.
This misunderstanding has been created because of two characteristic words which exist in the Platonic text. One word is the word visa, and the other is isomeni. Visa was wrongly translated to submerged. But when you have pitikoetio, a special condition where the energy of a verb returns to the subject, then this verb has different meaning. And the meaning actually is covered. So we are talking about two totally different meanings. Sank, wrong translation, or it's steady and was covered by the sea. The actual meaning of isomeni is that it was settled and not inundated. Definitely impossible to have a flooded continent. It was not flooded also the Rhonic Island, but it was flooded the capital city of Atlantis.
Plato never wrote that an island or a continent sank. Instead, the destruction of Atlantis would have gone something like this.
First, a huge earthquake in the region of the rhombic island. Second, an influx of water from an adjacent inland sea. This may have been combined with liquefaction of water-saturated land on the rhombic island, causing a landslide. Either of these could have caused a localized tsunami. Third, after the liquefaction, loose clay stopped up the drainage of excess water from the ringed capital city. It alone was flooded as a consequence. Lastly, as the Green Sahara monsoons continued, runoff arrived and kept the Rashat structure full of water. Allegedly, it was still swamped around 600 BC when the Egyptian priest told Solon the story. I met with Oregon State University earthquake expert Dr. Scott Ashford to see if George's description was possible.
Is there any way that a tsunami could sink a continent? The answer is no. The amount of energy that is generated in the earthquake and then the amount of energy that it carries in that tsunami is nothing compared to what it would take to sink a continent. But are there ways that an earthquake and a tsunami could destroy a city, remove a city, make it look like it's been wiped off the face of the earth?
Mauritania isn't known for strong seismic activity in recent decades, but smaller earthquakes
do tend to cluster around a region to the north of the rhombic island.
Can we get a big earthquake in an area where we don't normally have earthquakes? And certainly the Pacific Northwest is a great example. We get these great earthquakes every 300, 400, 500 years. Sometimes there's 1,000 years between these great earthquakes.
The deadliest earthquake in recorded history was likely Shaanxi, China in 1556, where an area 520 miles across was completely destroyed, and an estimated 830,000 people were killed.
An earthquake in Japan last decade caused thousands of landslides just because it happened to take place during the rainy season. If you were to walk on liquefaction, it would be like quicksand, and you'd just sink right into it. The sand loses all its strength. The slope will fail, will cause a landslide in the Hawaiian Islands. Part of one of the islands slid away, caused a tsunami that affected the nearby islands.
If the adjacent sea was struck by an earthquake, or if a huge landslide plunged into the rings of water around the Atlantean capital city, it would have created a powerful tsunami, one of the deadliest natural disasters on Earth.
If you have a landslide that falls into a small sea or a big lake, causes a wave, that wave hits a nearby town, certainly that can wash away some of the smaller structures. Depends how big it is. So this huge machine behind me is our tsunami wave basin. And there are paddles along the back that are computer controlled and allow us to generate almost any kind of wave. We've actually had a scale model of some cities, and we look at what is the effect of a tsunami on this town.
It gives you that feeling of what a real disaster would have looked.
Yeah. That's a tsunami. How do these natural disasters interact? A tsunami or landslide, it carries all the debris along with it. I've seen the sand almost look like toothpaste filling up all the drainage canals. As the water dissipates, it's going to leave your drainage system filled with dirt. If you have flooding after that, right, there's nowhere for the water to go. Plato, right, the way that he describes different events has truth into what we observe today. Flooding, earthquakes, liquefaction, landslides, any of those could have destroyed the settlement, making the town unviable. While there may be some damage, they may not be able to continue their commerce, and the town still dies.
Ever since George's ideas became known, adventurers have gone to the Mauritanian desert looking for the remains of a lost city. In 2020, satellite images allowed for the discovery of hundreds of stone ruins in the Rashat area. These ruins, however, remain undated, and even if found to originate close to 9600 BC, they are a far cry from the massive city described in the myth. Mighty palaces, irrigation systems, temples, gymnasiums, boathouses cut in stone, and city walls dozens of kilometers long. Here, in the details of the city, perhaps we are encountering some of Plato's untruths. Today, we tend to associate great civilizations with titanic works of architecture, as did the ancient Egyptians and Greeks. But the construction of large temples, fortifications, and palaces only makes sense if a large population is dwelling in a single area for an extended period of time. What if our ancestors didn't? The Mongolian Empire was the largest contiguous land empire in human history, conquering everyone they found in their path. Living on the move, they weren't prolific builders. They were a free-ranging, nomadic population that still maintained a few permanent or semi-permanent settlements. This pattern was almost universal in the early Holocene. Temporary camps and seasonal movement were the default way of life. In fact, the nomadic lifestyle dominated North Africa all the way until colonialism arrived. Some, like the Tuareg, maintained their traditional ways up to the early 20th century. Maybe the idea of the Atlantean capital sprang from later people, the Egyptians and Greeks. They might have imposed their own cultural assumptions about architecture onto the story of the Atlantean Empire, dreaming up an enormous capital city, where in fact, only hunter-gatherer villages and fishing encampments once existed. Whoever discovered bits of such ruins and stone tools around the Rashat might have inferred that they were tiny remnants of an epic city that met its destruction long in the past. With certain embellishments, perhaps the myth of Atlantis does record the last vestiges of a great, ancient African empire. But there must be dozens of ways the story could have come down to us. Was it made up by ancient Mauritanians to explain a puzzling geographic feature and found its way to Egypt over time via trade caravans? Was the Atlantean culture completely fabricated, or was its description by the Egyptian priest true in some respects and not in others? Was the story based on a real cultural memory of Niger-Congo hunters attacking Nile Valley civilization at the dawn of the Holocene? Was it enhanced with reports of ruins at a far-off ringed landmark? Did the priests of Sais invent certain dramatic aspects as allegory? Or did Solon, Critias, or Plato himself? At each step along the way, changes might have been made, facts confused, or elements invented. There's simply no way to know the truth with 100% certainty. But what if we're asking the wrong questions?
Plato's intent with the myth of Atlantis might have had nothing at all to do with where it supposedly was or who lived there. It might have had everything to do with how we understand our distant human past and how we think in the present.
The Atlantis myth has had people chasing lost continents for millennia, and yet most of us have failed to ask why Plato cared so much about this particular ancient tale. The fundamental theme appears to be the destruction of Atlantis due to hubris and moral corruption. But the story isn't about the loss of just one civilization. It takes an Egyptian priest with a temple full of records to make the Greeks realize that they have completely lost their own past. Is this myth more about Atlantis or the ancient Athenians? In Plato's era, the Greeks knew a legendary people had preceded them and had possessed writing that was later lost, along with all the history it represented. In fact, Greece had writing from at least 1850 BC. One script we know of, Linear B, lasted centuries. But it all vanished when the great palaces of the Mycenaeans were destroyed in the 12th century BC. For hundreds of years afterward, the Greeks were illiterate before writing was reinvented. This same theme of civilizational destruction and cultural loss was also present in Plato's own time. Not only did he experience decades of war himself, but 2 generations before he was born, Athens was utterly destroyed by an invading Persian army. nearly everything was lost. And yet, even when the most sacred temples were sacked and burned, the core myths of Greek culture, the Iliad and the Odyssey, lived on. Plato realized that myth might be the most durable way of preserving knowledge and wisdom across time. Atlantis, a story of destruction, simultaneously acts as a tool for cultural preservation. Functioning as an ancient time capsule, this myth allows us to ponder the same questions he posed to his students more than 2,000 years ago. How can we know ourselves as a culture if we have forgotten our past? How do we know what is true if we have no records of what happened? How do we preserve the continuity of civilization, knowing that disasters will strike and that everything can be so easily lost? We shouldn't be surprised that Plato's myth is something very different from what we might expect, a profound teaching device in the form of a puzzle.
Do not underestimate any detail. It's a very high scientific document, and you can use it to teach either a child or an initiate.
A modern puzzle has a single solution or answer, but the Atlantis myth presents an entirely different kind of puzzle, a multi-layered apparatus designed for improving your thinking, yourself, and how you see the world, a world where everything is richly connected. Plato's best students knew all the writings and historical events we've covered: the Odyssey, the Iliad, Herodotus' history, the Persian Wars, and the Peloponnesian War. Given the keen minds of this audience, Plato could freely play with a vast array of ideas. If you look hard, you may begin to notice certain connections and double meanings. The size of the Atlantean military recalls Greek estimates of the army that destroyed Athens in the Persian War. The sequence of the Atlantean War echoes the flow of the Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta that shook Greece to its foundation, just as it began to recover from fending off the Persians. Or perhaps you'll see how Plato requires you to bend your thinking when he writes that the length of Atlantis is longer than Libya and Asia together. This distance is only definable if we realize that the phrase is nearly word for word from Herodotus when he describes the length of Europe. And this length doesn't fit Atlantis unless we curve it into an arc to follow the shape of the continent. Moving away from thinking in a straight line is powerfully emblematic of the approach it takes to reach the hidden meaning in Plato's myth. This becomes most apparent in the journey from familiar waters into the unknown lands of Atlantis. To get to Atlantis, one first had to pass the Pillars of Heracles. But the word Plato used for the pillars, stela, didn't mean a structural column or natural formation like the Rock of Gibraltar. A stela was a commemorative stone plaque, something demarcating the edge of Greek expansion, the limits of what was known. When you pass by this marker, you enter an enormous, uncertain territory that you must navigate completely on your own. It is exactly this territory that Plato wants us to seek. To succeed there, you'll have to look past easy answers, leaving linear thinking behind. and you'll only find your way by grappling with conflicting information and complexities at the same time. Perhaps Atlantis signifies that while the knowledge of the moment may crumble and fade with time, we will always need to discern between true and false. And even if we'll never reach a perfect, ultimate truth, there is still virtue in taking a step closer to it, if we can. In today's world of fake news, Plato's challenge couldn't be more necessary or timelier. The myth of Atlantis, in that sense, holds a greater truth than all our scientific theories and archaeological digs.
I was looking for Plato and found Atlantis. The other guys are looking for Atlantis and forgot Plato.
Plato invited his students into a hidden way of engaging with the puzzle he'd created, where cultural continuity and the individual's journey toward wisdom come together in an extraordinary way. The timeless way of the initiate. This way of thought is perhaps best illustrated in trying to answer one of the most stubborn enigmas of this entire story: the fact that the Atlantis myth has no ending.
You realize that you might have in front of you a puzzle to solve. Do not underestimate the text.
Critias appears unfinished, as if Plato was writing it one day, put his pen down mid-sentence, and never got around to completing the story. Or maybe he did finish it, and the manuscript was partially destroyed by time, leaving us with only a fragment. These are the official explanations. But let's take a closer look. The cut-off end of Critias takes place in a conference of the gods where Zeus addresses the subject of the Atlanteans. Zeus, realizing that the chosen race was behaving despicably, wishing to punish them, called to council all the gods, and on having assembled them said what? Knowing what you know now, doesn't the idea that Plato simply left off mid-sentence seem just a little suspicious to you? To get to the bottom of this enigma, we need to think like one of Plato's initiates. Plato challenges you not to memorize what he says, but to think for yourself. As we met to discuss his work for the last time, George demonstrated the depth of his own thinking, revealing a connection between Plato's Atlantis and Homer's Odyssey that no one had ever realized before. Critias has always been considered unfinished, leaving us to conjecture about the full extent of the Atlantis story we have lost. But George has strong evidence the mid-sentence ending was intentional, and that scholars have misread it for centuries. When Zeus calls together all the gods to make his cut-off speech at the end of Critias, we're presented with a scene identical to one that takes place right on the first page of the Odyssey. Only Poseidon is missing from the conference of the gods in the Odyssey. And why? Poseidon had gone to visit the Ethiopians worlds away to receive an offering, bulls and rams by the hundred. He's busy enjoying an animal sacrifice in Africa, much like the one Plato has the Atlantean kings perform in Critias. Poseidon is the patron god of Atlantis and a traditional rival to Athena, goddess of Athens. He was also god of the sea and of earthquakes, which together destroyed the Atlantean capital city. the matching conferences of the gods called by Zeus, the links to Africa and Poseidon's special role there, the parallel animal sacrifices. These connections between Critias and the Odyssey seem too obvious not to have been deliberate. Where is Plato leading us?
Plato is forcing you to find out the right piece which is missing. Make a cross-check between Atlantis story and Odyssey story. Decide by yourself what could be the end of the story.
Look at how the Atlantis story ends, seemingly mid-sentence. And now here's Zeus speaking at an identical gathering of the gods on page 1 of the Odyssey. Zeus, realizing that the chosen race was behaving despicably, wishing to punish them, called to council all the gods, and on having assembled them said, "O alas, how mortals put the blame on the gods. They declare that from us stem their misfortunes, while it is often they themselves who with their bad deeds fall into grief beyond what's written." It doesn't cut off part way because Plato was too lazy to finish it. He did it on purpose. It redirects you back to the beginning of the Odyssey.
And what is the story of the Odyssey?
A man who left the civilization that he knows and has to go on this long, circuitous journey. He has to suffer and struggle mightily just to get back to the point where he started from.
Welcome, Jack, to the realm of Plato's initiates.
Thanks, George. This is Plato's meta lesson about the continuity of human civilization. If we did not fight against corruption in our society and ourselves, and if we do not plan ahead for periods of disaster, we will wind up reduced to ignorance, losing all the great blessings we enjoy. And it will be a long, circuitous, and tortured odyssey to get back to where we began. It's certainly possible that things are that way, but it is also possible that they are not. So you must investigate them courageously and thoroughly, and not accept anything easily. You are still young and in your prime after all. Then, after you've investigated them, if you happen to discover the truth, you can share it with me.
I think we can learn not to ignore the myths, right? And I think, all the time we're finding what we thought was a myth, now we find actually is a reality.